Welcome back to our chapter on motivation. We're going to pick up where we left off and talk about hunger, one of the most primitive, basic, and common forms of motivation we each experience every day. Now, hunger is, of course, quite common, but it is often sometimes misunderstood. While as kids, we think about the hunger system as something based on our stomach, what we eat, and yes, that is part of the system, part of the process, such as digestion. Ultimately, it is the brain that controls when we are hungry and when we are full. Specifically, it's the part known as the hypothalamus, something we looked before in Chapter 2. The lateral hypothalamus is what stimulates us to want to start eating, and the ventromedial hypothalamus is what reduces hunger and eating. So, quite literally, there's a biochemical switch that says it is time to eat and it's time to stop eating. We know this to be the case because there are unfortunate men and women who have had accidents or other seizures, other neurological problems where that area of the brain was destroyed and they simply were never full, no matter how much they ate. Now, I want to talk about hunger not in terms of the basic biology, that's something that you can learn in a different course, but I want to talk about when the behavior moves outside the expected norm of the motivation. I mean, after all, if we are wired, if this primary drive of hunger is something in all of us, then why is it that there are some individuals who eat too much or eat too little, as we'll see in our chapter on eating disorders when we talk about mental health? So obesity is one of those motivational mysteries. And let me clarify some terms before we start talking about obesity, and that is I don't want you to confuse the term, especially terms like overweight, with what we're talking about. Overweight by the biological definitions, the medical definitions, such as through the CDC statistics. If you're called overweight or obese by these standards, we are saying you have a certain percentage of body fat that puts you at a higher risk for certain illnesses or conditions. We'll look at a few examples of those in a bit. Today, in our modern society, we often misuse the word overweight in some sort of beauty standard. So you could have someone who looks a certain way, who has a certain body size, and a couple of years ago we would consider that attractive or sexy. But today, perhaps they will say that person looks overweight by some arbitrary standard. That is not what these numbers are referring to. We're talking about our physical and, as we'll see, perhaps even psychological health. Now, our obesity rates have been rising in the U.S. If we look at this chart from the 1980s, and I'll take us all the way to 2009, you can see that the percentage of men and women who are obese is drastically increasing year after year. For several decades, America was the #1 country in the world for obesity. We've now moved into the #2 slot, but that doesn't mean that's something we need to celebrate. It's still a very serious problem that we need to consider and start to think about solutions. Now, one of the reasons it's serious, or I guess several of the reasons that I want you to see, is that obesity is linked to a large number of health risks. That's why we care. We'll talk about body image and beauty standards in a different chapter when we revisit eating disorders, as I previously alluded to. But realize I'm talking about obesity today only because it is a real biological and sometimes psychological risk, and your health and your happiness might be also at risk. Things like cardiovascular disease, anything dealing with the heart, breathing difficulties, respiratory difficulties such as apnea, diabetes, type 1 and type 2. In fact, we've seen a growing rate of type 2 diabetes in children. And yes, even mental health's mentioned, whether that's because there are actual biological anomalies in the obese individual, or perhaps simply being in the fact that we live in a culture that has very strict beauty standards. And so if you're overweight or obese, you're more likely to experience mood disorders, anxiety disorders, because of those harsh standards turned against you. But ultimately, as I said, obesity is a motivational mystery. I've just mentioned this idea of drive reduction theory. You're hungry, you have that drive state, you get food, you're full, you return to homeostasis. Shouldn't we be done? Well, it turns out there are a number of reasons why we might be stuck in this sort of obese cycle, this difficulty we have. And so I'm going to give you quite a few variables. And really the main thing you need to understand as we talk about this subject is this. If you believe that there is one thing that will solve all of our obesity issues for each individual, you're wrong. Obesity is a complex problem. There are a number of issues, a number of variables that are affecting men and women and children. There are some great suggestions that could help many people, but if you believe it will help all, you may be incorrect. So let's look at some of those variables that are setting the stage that might explain why we're moving beyond this motivational need, this drive state, to this idea of eating far more than we need to. We'll start first with biology, which is something that often gets ignored, but the truth is all of us are born with certain genetic set points, basically biological markers based on our metabolism on how large or small we'll be when we simply don't try. We do know that weight, and certainly the case of obesity, seems to be linked, at least in part, to genetics. When we look at identical twins, for example, even those raised apart from each other, they tend to be the same body size, to have the same set point. Some of you, when you simply are not trying, remain relatively thin, while others, without trying, have to work, well, I guess I should say have to work really hard to maintain even a moderate level of body fat. So we're all different biologically, which is the first place we have to start in talking about obesity. And again, we have to be careful of well, everyone should do what I do. Your body, your variables, your environment is quite different from the next person. There's also psychological reasons that might explain why we're having such an obesity problem. For example, much of our culture involving food is based on conditioning. For example, why are you always hungry at noon? There's nothing in our biology that says we're supposed to eat at, quote, lunchtime. We invented lunchtime, and since we were little kids, we've been told and conditioned this is when to eat. So even if you have a really big breakfast and it's time for the traditional lunch to come, you feel like you have to eat because this is what I'm supposed to eat. I start to feel hungry, even though technically you probably wouldn't be if you hadn't been conditioned that way. Or perhaps every time you go to the movies, you buy popcorn and a drink because that's part of the movie experience, which is fine. But what about on that day where you have a big dinner and then go see a movie? You were quite full when you left the restaurant, and just a few minutes later in the movie theater, even if you are still full, you find yourself still buying that snack, still buying that drink because it's part of the experience. That's learned associations. We also find that biology and culture are colliding when we look at our evolutionary past. It turns out that many animals, not just us, have certain eating behaviors. We have certain behaviors based on our hunger drive that make sense if we are an animal living in the wild, as we once were, but in today's modern world simply get us into problems. Let me give you 3 examples of that. For example, we as humans are wired to eat attractive foods. It makes sense in the wild because, as a general rule, if food is attractive, it's ripe and ready to be eaten. Fruits and vegetables, things like that. If you give a small child a ripe apple and a rotten apple and you say, which one would you like to eat? Even the youngest child will pick the right fruit just on their eyesight alone. But in the modern world, we can make everything attractive. And in fact, we make the best, well, I should say we make the worst foods the most attractive. Desserts, which are typically not the most healthy of foods, are those that are the most visual appealing. In fact, many restaurants know this, and so when they walk you to your table, they have a glass rack filled of their desserts for you to look at. You can't smell them, you can't taste them. All you have is your eyes, but it's enough to make you want them because we're drawn to attractive things. Secondly, not only humans, but many animals are wired with the instinct to eat food whenever it's available. And that makes sense. If we're living in the wild, there are no stores, there are no grocery stores or farmers markets. You follow the food, you harvest the food, and ultimately, if you think about what is fat, well, fat is an energy store for when food is not around. But today's world, food is the most plentiful it's ever been. And not only that, here in the U.S., the food that we have access to has incredibly large portion sizes, especially when you look at other cultures who eat similarly to us. And finally, eating food that's easiest to get. In the wild, it makes perfect sense. If you have fruit on a high-hanging branch and a low-hanging branch, you go for the low branch. It's just as good. You've expended less energy. It's safer, less of a risk. But in the modern world, the food that we have the easiest access to is that which is worst for us. All right, so the fast foods, the cheap foods, those things which are all contributing to obesity. Now, one last thing on obesity, we can pull the lens back and look at culture. And I've got 2 points here that actually both of these are fantastic things, but we must realize there's a price for what we've created. I told you earlier that food is the best access, or we have the best access to food that we've ever had. And don't get me wrong, there's still famine, there's still problems throughout the world and in our country. But globally, we are making food at the best rates than we ever have in human history. Well, we have better access to food, and not only that, we have better technologies that makes our life easier, However, when we mesh those two together, we do find ourselves living a life that's quite sedentary. The things we do for fun and even the things we do for work, for most of us, aren't physically demanding, and therefore we're not expending the same energy we once were. So more food, less physical responsibilities. Generally, that's a good thing, but there is a byproduct, and that might be our own physical health. All right, we're going to stop there. We looked at obesity. Now, as a quick reminder, yes, sometimes when I talk about obesity and hunger, I like to add the other end of the motivational mystery and talking about eating disorders like anorexia or bulimia. I'll actually save those specific topics for a mental health chapter, but they are great additions to the topic on hunger and motivation. So do check those out if you wish, but you'll see those soon in a video. We'll stop there. When we come back, we'll talk about sex and sexuality, also part of the common human motivation. See you then.